Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome, dear viewers, to another one of our live episodes of Huda Tonight, and I'm your host for the evening, Junaid Dar. Dear viewers, we have two fantastic segments prepared for you today. In segment number 2, we're going to have a discussion about Lebanon and Hezbollah, and in segment number 3, we're going to continue our fantastic journey through the Quran, looking at the beautiful Surah Al-Baqarah. Coming back to segment number 2, dear brothers and sisters, as you're aware, we're going to be talking about Lebanon and Hezbollah. Lebanon is a very small country in the Middle East, but yet it finds itself in the center of all of the conflict in the Middle East. And there are a number of reasons for that. First and foremost, Lebanon does share a border with Israel and shares a border with Syria. Furthermore, you find that Lebanon consists of a group or a collection of minorities from Sunnis to Shias to Christians to Druze. So you have a mixture of people living in one country. Furthermore, you also have the Shia militia organization by the name of Hezbollah, which now has a political party inside of Lebanon. So there's lots to discuss, and we want to understand Lebanon's role in the Middle East. And to do that, we have with us Professor Cmad. He is a lecturer in political science and strategic studies, and mashallah, you've been with us on a number of different programs, and we've discussed a number of different countries from Yemen to Iraq to Syria. Professor, I'd like to welcome you to the program. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. Professor, if you don't mind, I want to get stuck in straight away, and I want to talk about Hezbollah. My first question to you is the origin of this organization. Where did it come from? What's its historical context?
Well, if we look at the 1979, starting with the revolution of Iran, the expansion of the revolution under the leader Khomeini, from that started to have different kind of ambition plans to expand into the Middle East and expand their ideology, one of which was in Lebanon, started after 1982 with the occupation of Israel to the south of Lebanon, or a slice or a strip of the South Lebanon in 1982. Okay. From that on, we found the collapse, or saw the collapse of the South Lebanese army, and we had a group of Iranian soldiers basically moving to Lebanon with the ideology to fight the Israeli occupation, and that became the seed for establishing basically Hezbollah as a group of radical Muslims, if you like, as the ideology or the manifesto basically describes them, which was issued in 1985. So the establishment of Hezbollah came about after the Israeli occupation to south of Lebanon, and they had in their manifesto to focus on protecting the Lebanese people, except ones that collaborate with Israel, fight the Israeli and American imperialism. So, unfortunately, they do belong to the Shia side of Islam. They're not Sunnis, and basically they enjoy the full support of Iran. Basically from funding money or to weapons to training, etc.
So would it be fair to say that they originally started off as a force that wanted to liberate Lebanon from Israel?
Some sort of militia, as you described them. That was the beginning, but later on, particularly after the manifesto 1985, starting towards the end of the 80s, they started to basically melt down in the Lebanese society by having certain hands in politics. They started to join elections later in late 90s. So it had a long time to develop really, but their main ideology was a military group to fight the Israeli and American imperialism and the occupation of South Lebanon.
Okay, fantastic. And as you mentioned, they are a Shia organization, and any militia, in order for it to work, requires funding. So who is giving Hezbollah its finance?
Well, their finances come from Iran particularly, and as we said, they are followers of Khomeini, and basically, as we said, the revolution of Iran came about against the Shah in 1979, and from that on, the expansion of Iran as a Shia hub basically started in the Middle East, and we saw from that part going to cause problems with, in Saudi Arabia. We've seen we've noticed that in the 80s during Hajj, part in Yemen, part basically in Sham, all over in Syria and in Lebanon. But the one that was really transformed or translated into a fully organized group was Hezbollah. Unlike the rest in the other Arab world, they were just normal minorities.
Okay.
They never really managed to get themselves organized. And basically here you've got a number of factors to play that made them such powerful organization. The military training they had, full support from Iran in terms of military training. What also helped them, besides the funding, is the actual support of the Syrian army.
Right.
Because the Syrian army was controlling that part of Lebanon as well until the assassination of Hariri, when the whole thing just collapsed, and they were instructed to basically by force from the United Nations to withdraw fully from Lebanon. And from that, Bashar al-Assad took all his troops back. But during that time, Hezbollah enjoyed full support of the Syrian army to basically establish them well, help them in training, help them with finances, help them to get organized,
okay.
because they help them in protecting their own identity.
And just to understand the bigger picture, is it fair then to say that the Syrian army was also a Shia army which
That's
collaborated
right,
with
that's right.
Hezbollah?
The majority of them are Alawis, and this is one of the problems in Syria, and you find that at this point, because you've got part Sunnis and part Shia, and if you find Muslim Brotherhood in Syria, they are Sunnis. So it is a problem, and this is really, as we said, was one of the main reasons that helped Hezbollah to establish itself well. And slowly move from just a small radical military group or a militia into a full organized parties afterwards, because
okay.
they had, end of the 90s, close to 12 people in parliament. They became a part of the unified government in Lebanon in the 90s. So they managed to establish themselves well during the presence of the Syrian army.
Okay, fantastic. That brings me nicely over to the next question. It seems that Hezbollah gained more and more support towards the end of the 1980s.
Yes.
And so could you tell me how was that possible?
Well, during the 80s, after the manifesto of 1985, which basically explained why the present in the Middle East, looking at a number of objectives such as fighting the Israeli and military and American imperialism, protecting Islam, protecting Muslims, and regaining the power of the Muslim nation. So if you look at the manifesto, they had a well-defined manifesto that basically start with. And if you look at it from the Islamic point of view, it's very noble. However, the actual implementation itself became problematic in terms of how they go about things. What actually made them look after themselves military-wise or weaponry-wise, they were always classified as a terrorist organization. So
okay.
they found there's no way to get involved in politics. So they always maintain full military preparations. And later on in the 80s, they prepared full, it's a multi-faceted brigades to basically fight or target the Israeli soldiers on the border. And when we look at the war, end of 90s, beginning of 2000, Israel never really managed to get in, because it's a fully funded army in Hezbollah and fully organized.
But Professor, how does a militia like this, which is, as you said, working with small arms and causing problems at the border and so on and so forth, how does a militia organization then become a member of parliament with seats inside parliament? How does that transfer take place?
What they managed later on is transforming themselves from a military or fully pure military group into a full society that had politicians, military wing, lawyers. They developed themselves, and they basically melt themselves into the Lebanese society. And because of their support to the Lebanese society, the Lebanese themselves accepted them, particularly in the south,
okay.
because they had no option. Israel is occupying the south of Lebanon. The Syrian army withdrew after the assassination of al-Hariri. So the Lebanese themselves, as you kindly mentioned in the beginning, part of them are Sunnah, part are Shia, and part Druzzis, and some are basically Christians. So the fact here is the Lebanese has always had that broken nation or a government. So the Hezbollah provided that protection, and that basically what helped them in maintaining the role to play in politics. And if you look at the type of war that we gone through, particularly in the 90s, if you look at the 1970s was the end of the first generation of war, which is an organized army against an organized army, and that's basically what happened in the 50s, 60s, and part of the 70s, like 1973. But if you look at the second generation was all about militia fighting. And that basically gave them, because the trend in terms of how you fight your enemies became that model itself. So as a small group, you could actually fight a well-organized army if you know what you're doing.
Right.
And getting into the third and fourth generation war, basically looking at war by proxy. So you appoint somebody to fight on your behalf. And this is what Iran was always doing, is getting Hezbollah the forefront to fight Israel on its behalf.
Right.
We've seen always the threat of Israel to Iran, always had that threat. So Hezbollah became the thorn in the back of Israel, and Iran has managed really well to keep that thorn painful to the Israeli society.
Professor, I've never really quite understood the relationship between Iran and Israel. At times you find them friends, and at times you find them foes. What's really going on?
Politics is about benefits. Basically, and I'll give you an example. When we heard about the military aircraft, the Russian military aircraft that was shot over Syria by the Turkish army, people were saying, you know, Turkey is going to fight with Russia. No, it's not about that, because they got $40 billion deal of economic cooperation. So I will penalize you for the aircraft, but we're not going to break the relationship. So politics is not about black and white. Here you've got a problem between Egypt and Turkey, but yet there is diplomatic representation here in Egypt, and there's diplomatic representation of Egypt in Turkey. Might be minimal, but there is representation. So cutting relationship completely is absolutely non-existent. That was in the first generation war, where you just take all your stuff and I'll take my stuff and start fighting. But the fact here is, with the movement of private sector and multi-organizations, it's very difficult to control it. Because if you have two countries are fighting, for example, like Iran and Saudi Arabia, for example, you find that there is private sector that's importing and exporting. You just can't control it. And there's money moving around.
So now war is multifaceted. It's not just
exactly,
arms,
and economics play a role.
Right.
So you can't. And this is for when you look at the penalties that were enforced on Iran. Part of it is a private sector. The money that was basically blocked. Part of it is private sector, because you can't just target the money of the country. You just don't know what it is. But you block everybody who's part of your enemy. In terms of penalties, economic sanctions.
Now in this generation, war is a game of chess, where you've got to play all your soldiers.
Absolutely. And you can see that there is talks now between Saudi Arabia and Turkey to fight Daesh. But at the same time, there is the Saudi political system is not accepting Bashar as a ruler of Syria. You find that here Turkey supports the Muslim Brotherhood, yet there is talks between Saudi Arabia and Turkey, even though Saudi Arabia is against the Muslim Brotherhood. So it's a play, it's a role play, as we call it. So the fact here is, in the end, you can play different roles, yet you've got to have a minimum to get back on, and there is a red line where you don't cross. So we will have, for example, a cooperation against a third person, but there is a limit on how far we can go. So this is really the importance, is that we just can't go all the way and became enemies with the others.
Right, okay, well said. I want to look at the coin from the other side, and I want to look at Western involvement or Western propaganda when it comes to Hezbollah. Many times we find Hezbollah being portrayed as a terrorist organization and so on and so forth, but yet we find Hezbollah growing or gaining popularity. I mean, what's the relationship between Western propaganda and the growth of Hezbollah?
This is basically highlighting or framing the fourth generation of war, which is the war of information. Media plays a role in that, where you influence people. Unfortunately, you've got the probably not less than 40% of the Arabs are illiterate, where you find cultural erosion is absolutely easy to do through media. So the Western society always frames whatever is good for the Arabs as a bad thing. And that's how they play it. So they give impression about something, and in the end you find that it's not totally that way. In other words, you find that they're all talking about terrorism in Islam. But in actual fact, the Americans are moving more terrorism in the world than what a group of people can actually do. A group of people can bomb a building, but you destroyed Iraq in 1990. Through the NATO, they destroyed Libya. Now they're doing Syria. So the fact here is, it's the media. Whoever controls the media controls the world. And this is one of the weapons that the Jewish Zionism organization uses, is the media. Is how you always put the lie and keep on repeating it until it becomes a reality. And you find that the Western society, in actual fact, is surviving economically on the Arabs' money. Yet they're talking about a first world lifestyle. And in actual fact, it's our money that they're playing with. But they made the lie, and with time, people believe it. So the same thing that was followed with Hezbollah, the same thing that was followed with certain leaders in the Middle East. For example, they want to frame them bad, and basically with time people start hating them. Look at the beginning. If you look at Osama bin Laden, for example, who supported Osama bin Laden against the Russians? It was the Americans.
Of course.
So they use the media because they want to get into Russia. They want to penalize Russia, so they supported bin Laden. Now they made use of bin Laden, so he's no longer useful. So frame him as a terrorist organization, and that's how media play. So same thing is happening here. When they need Hezbollah, you find that they keep quiet, and you find that they're not as hot as they were, because now they have an agreement with Iran. And they know Iran is playing a role in destroying the Middle East, basically through the clash they had with Saudi Arabia on the Shia citizen, the role they're playing in Yemen, the role they're playing in Syria. So I will turn a blind eye when you serve my purpose. That's the bottom line. But at the time, all they're concerned about is the national security of Israel.
Professor, also the quote you mentioned there, I think it goes back to Hitler, where he said that if you say a lie and then you repeat it enough times, you'll find that people will start to believe it. But also, after the 1990s, Hezbollah had taken a different approach to integrate into society. How was that the case?
Well, the case here is that because of the withdrawal of the Syrian army, the difficulty they're facing with the Israeli army in terms of negotiations, the collapse of the Lebanese government one after the other, the collapse of the political system overall. So Hezbollah became to the Lebanese the only organized group that they can rely on. And therefore, they slowly accepted them. One of the good things that we also, you know, for the sake of God, we mention it, we didn't really find a lot of discrimination from Hezbollah against Sunnis. It wasn't really the case, because their main approach was military. It was ideology. And if you look at their manifesto in 1985, what they came about, they never said, we support the Muslim Shia. against the Sunnis.
To liberate.
Exactly.
Okay.
So they liberate and protect Muslims, whichever way they go. But they never really had the religious differences as a main factor in their manifesto. And therefore, they became acceptable. And slowly, a lot of Lebanese started to join them. A lot of Arabs also in different parts of the Arab world started to join them. And slowly, basically, getting into society, melting into it, and they got into politics. And if you look at the situation in the 90s, particularly after the Gulf War, the entire Middle East became broken.
Right.
In 1990, it took quite a few years. The collapse of, or the end of the Iraqi-Iranian war in 88, the changes in the world system, world order in the Middle East, I think helped Hezbollah to become one of the main players in politics in Lebanon, not just on a military side. They supporting the nation, the collapse of the Lebanese army, the collapse of the political system, basically was a great opportunity for Hezbollah to basically flourish. And a lot of people joined them. The funding is coming regularly, trained. So they became more and more organized. And as we said before, they have brigades. Basically,
so, Professor, as you mentioned, now that they're growing in strength and growing in number, we find that towards the end of the 1990s, Hezbollah decided to take on Israel.
That's right.
So
how did Olmert was the minister. There was a lot of clashes on the border, and Israel decided to attack Hezbollah. And if we look at the type of war that Israel basically implements, is just an air force. It's the long arm, they call it. But they really never go on a ground level because they're too coward to actually get in there. One of the difficulties that the Israelis faced with Hezbollah is how they are organized on a ground level. It's a very tight society. They all have that kind of vision and belief in what they're doing. And this is one of the good things about that particular group. They all believe in the same ideology, and that made it very difficult for their enemies to conquer.
They're united.
Exactly. They're very united, and they all believe in that. So the fact here is when Israel attacked them, they kept bombing them with aircraft, but they never really managed to get in. And this was a victory for Hezbollah at the time. And from that time, they became a recognized power in the Middle East. And before that time, they were described as just militias. But that war basically proved that Hezbollah is capable of actually going into an organized war because they have an organized army and they have organized, multifaceted brigades.
Professor, also, as you mentioned before, that Syria has been in control mostly of Lebanon until Syria's army withdrew from the south of Lebanon.
Yes, that's after the assassination of al-Hariri. And I think that was, despite the fact that Syrians had really caused a lot of problems in South Lebanon in terms of control, but I think they were standing quite well against the Israeli army to expand their occupation in South Lebanon. So they served a good purpose at that time. But after the assassination of Hariri, and Bashar was accused, the bombing of the al-Hariri car, I think after that time the United Nations decided you either withdraw or we're going to send forces to take you out. And from that time the occupation of Syria to Lebanon has really ended after al-Hariri. But look at the situation now. The only power you can actually see that supports Lebanon is Hezbollah.
And also, I would like to know, who was the beneficiary of the assassination of Hariri? Who benefited from that?
I think it's always, as they say in criminal law, look at who is the beneficiary.
Exactly.
And you will know who the criminal is. I think a Western society is quite clear what benefited from that, because as I said now, the Syrian army always stood as a shield for to disallow the Israeli army to increase their occupation. They just have a strip of South Lebanon, but they couldn't really get in. What the Israeli army wanted is take the entire the southern half of Lebanon.
Oh, really? Okay.
And Syria stood in there, so they became beneficial. And what they wanted is basically take the Syrians out so we can have, and you look at the how the events run. Take the Syrians out, so Lebanon become basically wide open to the Israeli army. But what they didn't realize that Hezbollah is prepared.
Okay.
So take Syria out, Lebanon becomes totally open for the Israeli army. The Israeli army goes in under the flag of fighting terrorism, which is Hezbollah.
As always.
So, exactly. So go and fight terrorism in South Lebanon, and from there they occupy the entire South Lebanon. But what they didn't realize that the Hezbollah is prepared. And basically, if it wasn't prepared, the entire southern half of Lebanon would have been totally occupied by Israel.
Okay. Professor, some people, some politicians and some thinkers will say that Hezbollah is one of the causes of instability in the Middle East or in Lebanon itself. Would you agree that Hezbollah is a liability to Lebanon, or would you say it's an asset?
No, I would say overall in modern nations it is a liability, because always any power in society that is not governmental, it's a liability. So you can have a group of youth that protecting an area, but if that youth is covered by legitimacy and a rule of law, is always it's going to be a problem. So Hezbollah doesn't matter how good it is to Lebanon, how protective it is to Lebanon. The fact here is it's a non-government organization. So in the end, you find that there is a competition going to be between Hezbollah and the government or the Lebanese army. So let's hypothetically, the government decides to build a Lebanese army. Is Hezbollah going to put down the arms? No, they won't. There you're going to always have the two-power struggle in a ship. So any power that is not legitimate, it is always an obstacle. And therefore, when it comes to negotiations with Lebanon around anything, when you find Hezbollah is there, it's easy to blow up the negotiation process. Because you can say, well, you've got a militia in there, you've got terrorists in there, we can't accept them. And if you look at the situations, it's always the case. You can have the, destroy the, negotiations with Libya because there's certain groups. You can destroy negotiations with Egypt because we're not sure about the Muslim Brotherhood regime in there. So there's always excuses. when you give them the excuse, particularly when it comes to the Muslim front, they use it.
Okay, I want to jump to our present day today and see what's going on in the world today. What is the role, being concise, what is the role of Hezbollah with the war in Syria today?
Hezbollah is another shield to protect Bashar al-Assad, and I think they're doing a very good job in protecting them from the south. If we look at Bashar, unfortunately the army is kind of broken between Shia and Sunnis. The rebels are also again Shias and Sunnis, but probably mostly Sunnis. But Hezbollah becomes again the arm extended from Iran to Bashar al-Assad through Hezbollah. So it's a link in there. And in the beginning we were talking about the post-revolution of Iran and the expansion of the Shia empire. They wanted to do it in the Middle East. I think they put arms everywhere. And the commencement of Hezbollah came from Iran. About 150 soldiers moving into Lebanon and put the seed to basically create a nail in the coffin in that particular area. So if you look at the situation in Yemen, it's exactly the same. So Iran is putting plots all over the Middle East and always going to see that plot exploding. And they're doing that in the entire Middle East. You will find this plot in Saudi Arabia, there's a plot in Egypt, always, but they blow it once they want it.
Okay, Professor, we have just a minute remaining for the program. Before we close, I want to talk about something we saw in a news item, which Brother Ali Coleman was mentioning, that Saudi Arabia is withdrawing from Lebanon support or financial support and calling its people to come back. What is going on in a nutshell?
I think it is again to do with Hezbollah, because definitely, and not just Saudi Arabia, most of the Arab world are against the Shia expansion. And I think the problem here despite the fact that it's to do with Syria, but I think the Shia expansion is worrying the major powers in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Emirates. And I think the withheld a number of talks around how to deal with the issue. But at this point, I think the absence of the Arab League is really the main thing, because you find individual initiatives from Saudi Arabia or Emirates or Kuwait, but where is the Arab League? So the fact here is Saudi Arabia, Emirates and Kuwait are trying to protect their own citizens by not keeping them in Lebanon, because we're not really sure how it's going to happen. Now there's talks around Saudi Arabia going into the alliance to fight Daesh. Fine, but if Daesh is supported by Hezbollah, then the Saudi citizens are in danger.
Yeah.
So it is quite clear. Unfortunately, it's part of politics where when you take sides, this is what you get. Your citizens become basically at risk.
Okay, Professor, we had a fantastic discussion on Lebanon and on Hezbollah. And if I could suggest for next week's topic, you brought it up, the Arab League. Many of us are ill-informed or uneducated on this matter. So could we talk about the Arab League next week?
Absolutely. The Arab League is an important topic. We also need to look at why are we having all these crises. Where is the big boss? The Arab League.
Okay, fantastic. That's a nice way to finish the segment. Thank you very much for coming to the program. Inshallah, we'll see you next week. Dear viewers, we have come to the end of segment number 2 here on Huda Tonight. What a beautiful discussion about Lebanon and looking at the role of Hezbollah in the world today, especially in the Middle East, and how we've discussed how Iran is trying to expand its hand in the Middle East and take control through militias such as Hezbollah. Dear brothers and sisters, let's take a